Hi guys. We are continuing on in John chapter 11 today, looking at verses 28 through 37. And this is the passage where we find Jesus weeping. So let's just see. What has just happened here is Jesus has just declared himself God once again, but this time to Martha. She has believed in him on his terms while her brother Lazarus was still in the grave. So when the very thing Jesus promised her would not happen, happened, her brother was now 4 days dead, Jesus, in that darkest place of death, grief, and pain, called her to extraordinary faith. And she amazingly obliged. That's a miracle in itself. But she believed that Jesus was exactly who he said he was, even when nothing she thought she knew for sure made any sense at all. Okay, so that's where we are in the story of Lazarus's death. And so we should really just stop right there for just a moment and consider the fact that no one ever comes to Jesus any other way than how this woman did. The only way anyone ever legitimately comes to Christ is on his terms. It's never on ours. And people get confused about this because there's a lot of false teaching out there. There's a lot of bad teaching out there, bad theology. But it's just not so. No one comes to Christ on their own terms, right? We come on his terms. We don't get to tell Jesus what the stipulations of our coming are going to be, or what the stipulations of our believing or our remaining and abiding in him are going to be. We want to say, well, Jesus, if you'll just do this, then I'll follow you. And if you won't, then, we get this bargaining thing. If you won't do these, thus and so, then we're just not going to follow you. We're just not going to pray. We're just not going to, acknowledge that you exist, because that's our deal, right? Let's make a deal. But it's not let's make a deal when it comes to following Jesus Christ. It's he makes the deal and we submit to it, or else we're not really following him and we're really not a disciple. Okay? So it's difficult, but Martha amazingly obliges. She says, yep, I believe no matter what I don't understand, no matter what, I believe. Okay? So she trusts in Jesus. He calls us to faith in extremely hopeless places at times with extremely hopeless circumstances. And he asks us to believe his promises. He expects us to believe them. And that's the only way that anyone ever believes rightly in Jesus. That's the only way a disciple is made. Okay? So we need to get that because there's a lot of bad teaching on that subject. Get that straight. It's pretty simple, not easy, but simple. So the very first thing Martha does after accepting Jesus on his terms is to go and to get her sister Mary. Okay, so the natural response we see here to obtaining saving faith and believing Jesus for hope in darkness is to go and to tell someone else and to bring them to Jesus too. That's the natural outflow of someone who genuinely believes and is a disciple who is set on following Christ, no matter what his terms are, right? Okay, so that's what we see Martha doing. So Mary then, after Martha comes to get her, goes quickly to Jesus upon being told that he is near. Now remember, she's in her house. She's grieving her brother who has just died. And there are mourners there. They would hire people to come in and mourn with them. And the whole house would be full of friends, family, and even people, just from the community who were even paid to be there crying with you. So she's followed by the Jews, of course, the religious men of the day who were already at her house consoling her in her loss. So this was kind of like their job mostly, right? It was their duty to be there. And so they're following her around. And so she goes to Jesus, and when she gets there, she says the same thing that Martha said. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. John 11:32. Now we know that Jesus could have healed Lazarus without being there if he wanted to. He did it with the centurion, right? Son. But he even went so far as to tell Mary and Martha when they came and said that Lazarus was sick that he would not die. And so you can imagine Mary's confusion, right? Why weren't you here, Lord? That's what she's asking. Why didn't you come? Why did you delay on purpose? Which is what he did. And of course we know Jesus has already told his disciples that he delayed because this is for God's glory, right? This sickness and this death is for God's glory. So that's why he delayed, but she doesn't know that. She's just confused about why her brother had to die after Jesus said he wasn't going to. So she falls at his feet and she utters these words, Lord, if you had just been here. And she's grief-stricken, she's confused, she's exhausted, likely she's overwhelmed with her own pain. And so Jesus doesn't overlook her condition, right? He doesn't tell her to get over it. He doesn't tell her, this is life. He doesn't say, just let it all go, you're fine. Jesus doesn't do that. That would be extremely insensitive, right? That would be heartless. Jesus doesn't do that. When Jesus sees her weeping, it says, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. John 11:33. So here we see the deep pain of one of Jesus's beloved lined up next to the disingenuous crying of hired mourners who had just been following her after her brother's death. Now, maybe some of them were genuine. I don't know, but more than likely, these guys were hired hands, right? They were there just crying, consoling, because it was their duty and their job. So what we see here is a sister's true pain. And Jesus sees it and it moves him. It says he was deeply moved, right? And then next door to that, we see a bit of a false showing of concern. They're not really concerned, they're just there out of duty, by religious people, religious fakers. And that makes him extremely troubled as well. And so we see here that Jesus cares deeply about the pain of his beloved, and it greatly troubles him that there are those who are religious fakes and they're unbelievers because they should be his brothers. They're false brothers, right? They're hypocrites. They're whatever they are. And Jesus knows this because he knows the end from the beginning, right? So Mary, his legitimate sister, he is grieving with when he sees her grief. But the Jews, whom he knew would not believe even after he did do the miracle, which was to come, the raising of Lazarus, he hasn't done it yet, but he knows, he was grieving over them, right? Like how he said, I have longed to gather you as chicks, but you were not willing. So Jesus is grieving with Mary. This is his sister whom he loves, and he sees her pain and he's grieving with her. He loved Lazarus, so he's grieving over that loss. And thirdly, he's grieving over his would-be brothers, the Jews, who aren't real, who are fake hypocrites, okay? And so he loved everyone. He loved the Jews and he loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus, but only Mary and Martha and Lazarus reciprocated, right? So he's dealing with the rejection of his brothers as well, the Jews. So we see here, Jesus is dealing with various levels of various types of grief in this same instance, okay? Have you ever been there? I've been there, right? I'm there. He doesn't have just one problem. How often do we just have one problem? It'd be nice if we only had one problem, and maybe sometimes we get relief that way. But Jesus here has a myriad of devastating realities laid out in front of him. He's about to be murdered. Let's just face that. He's about to be put up on the cross. And yes, he voluntarily does that, but he knows that. He knows his time is coming. He knows that he's going to be fully rejected by the ones that should have loved him the most, that should have seen him and known him the most. So he doesn't just have one problem. He has all these devastating realities laying in front of him. You know, his good friend has just died. His beloved followers are cut to the heart and confused about why he hasn't been there for them. His would-be brothers, the Jews, are about to be as false as the day is long to him. And as God, he knows and understands fully the magnitude of all he has just been dealt with in this one death. He's been dealt a heavy-handed, just a handful of troubles, I guess, with this one death of Lazarus. And as a fully human man, Jesus is just, I can imagine, overwhelmed with grief. And so the question we should ask here is, what does Jesus do with an overwhelming load of grief? What does he do with it? Because he is our example, right? He gets it. He's been there. Jesus asks where his dead friend is. Then Jesus cries when he gets there. So here's what Jesus doesn't do. Jesus doesn't hide from his reality, no matter how dark it is. He doesn't run away and pretend his friend isn't dead. He doesn't bury himself in work or in pleasure. He doesn't hook up with a woman. He doesn't get angry and bust up his house. He doesn't hate God the Father for it. He doesn't go to other people to get his comfort. He doesn't give up. No, all of those are the things that we do when faced with a tremendous amount of grief and darkness in our world. Jesus does something different with crushing, multifaceted grief. Jesus goes to the place where reality is. He arrives at the place of death and he cries. He cries. Simple, right? Simple enough. The Jews are confused, and again they divide. Some saw his grief as genuine, deep love that he had for Lazarus. Others didn't understand why a man who had already proven that he had the power to resurrect the dead and do miracles would be upset. And no one really understands, really, what he's going through. And so when he or we are dealing with various levels of deep personal pain, people don't get it. We can't expect them to. They don't. They won't. And maybe we want them to, but they don't. And so who could really, though, possibly understand what we're going through unless they themselves were going through it or have gone through it and had gone through it all at the same time, right? Like Jesus was. They couldn't understand. They can make their assessments and they can make their assumptions, but the truth is, at the end of the day, they end up insensitively injuring us often, presuming a lot, and more often than not, doing us a great injustice, as the friends of Job did. So Jesus cried, though, because he was human. Jesus cried because the reality of this life sometimes really is just too much to bear, right? Jesus cried not because he was incapable of moving forward or creating a future, but because what he had to bear was more than a man could or should keep to himself. Jesus cried because crying is the perfect, proper reaction to certain situations, even when you're a man. In fact, crying is the perfect, proper reaction to certain situations precisely because you're a man. And so here, Jesus teaches us that it's not only okay for men and women to cry, but that it is necessary and normal for men and women to cry when faced with the dark realities of our broken world. And we're all going to get there at one point or another. In fact, it's the best remedy and the only real release that we have when no one and nothing really even can rightly know and understand where our hearts really are and where they've been broken. And so when faced with the darkness and death in this life, we got to learn to be kind to ourselves. It's okay to cry. The Lord did. He didn't run away. He didn't try to dull reality. He went to the place of death. And he just took a good look at the truth and he treated it with tears. That was his remedy. And that's what happens when we love. That's what rightfully should happen when we love and care deeply about others in this world. And if we don't cry, it's hard to be human. It's hard to be a human who doesn't cry. So we learn from Jesus that it's okay to weep, and there are appropriate situations in which it's actually the best remedy. So I hope that's helpful, and I hope you guys have a good day. We'll see you tomorrow.